In this quick introduction, I'm going to show you two different techniques how we could take kind of like S1 to 3D catch scan, like this one, which has some leftover from the environment we don't need, as well as showing some digitizing artifacts and try to even those parts out and creating a newer and smoother base geometry to work with. If you download it from the web, then you don't have to do the next step. I have this one inside my alias file, and I would like to export this OBJ file. So I go to Export, Active, As, select OBJ, save, and then put it onto the desktop, for example. The program I would like to introduce you right now is actually called Meshmixer, and it's part of the 1-2-3D apps. And initially this was a digital sculpting tool where, like with the elephant, as you can see, was made for quickly fusing different polygon models together. And then actually Autodesk decided to acquire them and, for example, combine it with 3D printing. You can download it for Mac and PC, and it's free. So let me actually start Meshmixer. And that's the way how it looks. We can go to Import, and I go to the desktop. Here I have Esther's full model, and there it is. To rotate, or actually to pan, you can press middle mouse button. To rotate, you can press Shift and middle mouse button. And what I need to do first is actually go to Select, turn on the lasso, and for example, I'm selecting all those points, press Delete. Then I'm going to select those parts, delete, and I try to be careful not by accident to maybe cut into my full model. So let's rotate the view a little bit, and there, for example, we can see that there are some other problems. So for example, this part I would like to cut away. And for example, if I look from here, I can clearly see that this, for example, should not be part of my full model. Okay, so that actually turned out pretty well. Good. Then I have to fill actually those holes. We can do this when we go to Edit and actually go to Make Solid. That basically creates a new object and fills those holes. Obviously, it fills the holes pretty crappy because it only can linearly blend or patch it. So we click on Accept, and then we will actually end up with two shells. So for example, the old shell and the new shell. The old shell, which is open, we can delete. We don't need it anymore. Okay, so there's actually the full model. Inside here, for example, we could rotate it, so we could select it and, for example, go to Transform. For example, try to touch this up if we want to, and a top view, maybe line it up a little bit more with the mesh. Okay, and then for example we could go to Sculpt, and Sculpt is basically, think about it like digital clay. So when you go to the brush, you have different brushes, which basically means you could push and pull, you can add, you can subtract, you can flatten this body. And what I actually want to do is I want to smooth a little bit the surface. So I have, for example, here a strength slider. So I set it down maybe to something low, maybe go to 80. And hold on, before I do this actually, I go and say export, go to the desktop and say Meshmixer solid. So I just have a copy of this part. Okay, let's go back to the brush setting. And then, for example, you see when I brush over it and I'm pressing the left mouse button, you can see that it smooths out the surface just a little bit. So the trick here is to find a setting with the strength where you only do minor adjustments without changing, for example, the curvature or the shape of this part too much. And you can go over an area multiple times, and every time when you brush over it, it tries to clean it up a little bit. So, for example, like this. And then you could go and say export. And let's say I call this one Meshmixer smoothed. Also put it onto the desktop. Now, that model I actually could bring back into Alias. So I go to File, Import, Import. And then I want to select all. And for example, here is the smoothed version, open. And actually the way how it's going to be imported will be slightly rotated. That's because sometimes the programs actually confuse what's Z. In this case, in Alias, Z is actually straight up. If we go back to Meshmixer and actually click Edit and Transform, you see here the blue one is up as well, but sometimes what is Y and what is Z is being flipped between the programs, and that's the case here. But that's not really a big problem. We can simply select our object and then maybe let's change the pivot point to there. Could actually also press Shift Control, middle mouse button, center pivot point, and then go to rotate, left mouse button, and then I'm rotating and moving it into the correct position, for example, where my original scan was. Now the scan I have to rotate slightly as well. So I just line them up so basically you can see the similarity or the difference between them. Whoops, wrong tool. And there. Okay, so let's move this one out. Select nothing and, for example, compare. So we can see that actually this cleaned up version still shows some of the artifacts, for example, this dip here, but otherwise those additional elements got removed, and it's maybe okay to work with. But actually, I would like to go one step further and clean this up even more, and then also for pre-planning reverse engineering step, create a really clean representation or resurfacing of this one. And that one I'm going to show in the next step. In this step, I'm going to utilize Blender, which is a pretty good polygon modeler, which has similar functionalities like Meshmixer, but it actually has also a shrink wrap functionality, so I can create a dummy mesh and project it onto my full model and get a simplified but very clean representation. You can find Blender when you go to blender.org and you can click onto Blender 2.72 and then based on your operating system download the correct version. And let me start Blender. And that's the way how it looks. For those who are not very familiar, don't be afraid. The steps I'm going to show are actually very simple. One thing we have to first do is actually go to the user preferences. So you go to File, User Preferences, go to Input, and you want to click on Select with left and maybe turn on Continuous Grab. Then you can click Save User Settings and you're pretty much done. On the desktop, I have actually the file I would like to bring into Blender. So I go to File, Import, Wavefront, go to my desktop, and here's actually the solid model. I'm going to import that one. And I have to use my mouse wheel to zoom out a little bit. So there it is. I have various views. For example, if you go to View, for example, top or bottom or front. You can also on your numpad, for example, press 3, 1, and 7 for the different views, or for example 4 and 6 to rotate left and right, or for example 2 and 8 to go along the other axis. So you see 2 and 4 along the Y, and no, 2 and 8 along the Y, and 4 and 8 along the Z axis. Okay, so what I would like to do is actually try to create something that I can snap over it. Now first I would like to simplify this surface a little bit. So left mouse button, I can click on this one, and in case with left mouse button you see you're setting this bullseye, then you're still in right mouse button and you have to click right mouse button, and then you can click on the modifier, and we're going to add a function, and the function I'm going to use is actually called Remesh. Remesh basically means that it's rebuilding the surface based on certain properties. Here I would like to use smooth because we have a smooth object, and let's press 8 and 4 maybe to go into a quarter view, and you see this one is kind of choppy. Can maybe turn on smooth shading, doesn't really do much, because this one here I have to set to something like 6 in Esther's case. And you see the more I increase those values, the more I get closer to the model. And for example, with something like 7, you see this starts to look pretty close. Okay, but for example here, you can see I still see some of those issues. So what I'm going to do now is actually I'm going to sculpt over it. You can actually also move your view left and right by pressing Control 8 and 2 up and down, 4 and 6 left and right. And I'm going into the Sculpt mode. It's pretty much the same what, for example, Meshmixer has. I turn my modifier off, and then I can press T, for example, to open this tool palette, and here I click on smooth there. And with my mouse wheel, actually I can zoom in and out a little bit. I have a radius and I have a strength. And if I press left mouse button over it, let's see what happens. So you see if I continuously drag over it, I'm smoothing out more, and that's maybe not what I want. So Control Z undo it, maybe set this one to 25, but I can set the radius a little bit bigger. I can also press F, simply for quickly changing the brush size. So you see now I'm kind of like smoothing out bigger areas of my model. So I'm just brushing over it, and then maybe change my view a little bit, maybe along this edge. So I try to get rid of some of those problems there. And by having a very small strength, I'm somewhat softening out the surface without by accident doing too much change. So every time when I brush over it, I'm holding my left mouse button continuously pressed and just brush over it. I do just only minor changes to the surface. and softening a little bit. Keep in mind, this is a roughly curved form model, so we want to simplify this a little bit. And maybe a little bit here. So I'm just pressing just my numpad keys to do the change in orientations. There. Okay, great. Let's maybe take a look at this one with a matte cap. So I press N. Let's go to shading, matte cap, and maybe turn this one on. And looks actually pretty nice. Okay. Great. So I resculpted basically the surface a little bit. Let's see if I still have to do the remesh. So the remesh, I think, kicks out some of the problems a little bit. So you see, for example, here there were some irregularities still in the structure, and I just remove it. Okay, then let's go back to object mode. So again, here you switch between your different modes. And I'm ready now to create, for example, a surface over it. But first, I'm going to click on this orange cube. And here inside the text field, I, for example, call this one Meshmixer and gave the object a name. And then I can either press right mouse button if you set your mouse, your cursor to select in your preferences, and you see there's this 3D insert cursor, and then I go to add cube, and there's a cube. And in this case now I have to increase the size, and I can easily do this by going into edit mode and press S, and you see S, and then I'm dragging, make this really big. I can press tab to leave edit mode, press G to move this cube maybe to here, and then I can press R, for example, to rotate this a little bit. So I can use the scroll wheel to zoom in a little bit, and I press tab again. And up here, for example, I can select what type of geometry I would like to select. For example, a point, an edge, or for example, a face. A face, for example, selects everything at once, all those points and faces. And I can click on this face, for example. You see there are small cubes to click, and I can press E and drag this one out. Press R and rotate, press G to maybe move it down, and then press one more E, R, just position it to there, and I think here I might need a little bit more, and then one last, and I push this one far over. Then I can go to select vertex, press A, and A, you see it selects and deselects, and I can press C, and you see you have a small ring. With mouse wheel you can change the size, and if I click, you also see I'm in wireframe mode. I'm just selecting all those points because I'm actually moving those down to here. So A, B, G, A, B, and G. It's very repetitive. So I'm trying to kind of like space them out from a side. And I do this pretty big because later we're going to make this really blocky looking cage nice and soft. And then actually we're going to project it. Here I do one more extrusion because I would like to have a little bit more of geometry here to work with. Okay, like this. Then I can press 7 to go into a top view, select all those, and for example, move them to the side. B allows me to select everything here, and here I leave it. Okay, in this case now, I can go to the modifier tab and say subsurface, and maybe set it to. And let's press Z or go to solid, and you see kind of like the result I have. It's really big. round-looking object. And now actually I can go ahead a little bit and try maybe to get this a little bit closer. So you see all the time I press Z to see if maybe I'm getting too close, meaning the previous model starts to show there. Okay, in this case, not yet. And actually I can project the cage onto my mesh, because now I can select those points, for example, click on this arrow and, for example, move this in. There, for example, it pushes out. So here, maybe I adjust these points a little bit. Go to this view, and for example, here I select all those 4 points and see how far I can push and pull. Do the same here. There. There, for example, I'm going to get into a problem, so this one has to move to there. Maybe those can go in a little bit more. Okay, good. Those have to go down. So what I have basically now is, think about it like a pillowcase. And this is actually my core, and this is my fabric, and I would like this one to snap onto this object. Now the way how I can do this is I select my outside shell, go to the modifier, and then select shrink wrap. Here, for example, now I would like to say shrink wrap to what? To the Meshmixer surface. And at the moment I select this one, you see actually my object snaps to it. So my mesh, I'm actually going to move to a different layer. So I can go to move to layer and click the second icon. Here are the layer icons. So you see the layer system in Blender and Alias is a little bit similar in the way how it's presented. And let's take a look at what we have. So this is actually not too bad. Maybe I add one more subdivision. So the more view numbers or subdivisions I have, the more refined the project result will be. You see, if I go too high, I start getting lumps into my design again. So the challenge right now is try to find something that is nice and smooth. And then this mesh is being passed onto the shrink wrap. And then this one, for example, if I want to, I can smooth out one more step afterwards, or 2 steps. So this is, for example, now a really nice and soft rebuild of the original model. So let's take a look at actually how this one looks when we give this one a color. Let's go to here. So this one is a little bit inside, so I might have to offset it a little bit. Which means actually it's moving, offsetting like the whole result. Let's look inside. So I'm actually really tight and close to that surface. 0.1. Oh, this is way too much. 0.05. 0.03. Yeah, that, for example, is good. Okay, going back to layer 2. This, for example, is a really nice shell. In this one, for example, I could export, go to File, Export, Wavefront, go to the desktop, and for example here, let's say I call this one Blender smoothed. And I'm going to export only selected and apply modifier. Selected only means that I'm only exporting the part I wanted. And apply modifier means this modifier stack I created is being applied, so I get a high polygon model. Click on export. Then let's go to alias, go to file, import, file, go to the desktop. Here is the Blender version, open. See, it's the same size. I have to also rotate it, so Shift Control, middle mouse button, center the pivot point, and then I rotate it. Try to move it into the correct position. And for example, let's move this one kind of like to here, this one to there, select nothing. And then let's compare what we have. So when I, for example, turn on this nice glossy shading and you pay attention to the highlights and the details, you can see actually that this is a pretty good representation and rebuild of this model. And the initial Meshmixer design was still too wonky. I could have smoothed it out, but the problem is with more smoothing, I also would have softened sharper corners, which is why in this case I selected the case to rebuild the surface with the shrink wrap process in Blender, and then bring this polygon model back into alias. Now this one, for example, is going to be very usable for trying to recreate the surface in alias and not using the first, so the raw 1, 2, 3 catch or the raw Meshmixer version. Now the added advantage of actually going this route through pushing the geometry through Blender to recreate a new model and then actually bringing that into alias is I can actually take this model and push that actually into Fusion, and Fusion then creates a somewhat very complex but form-fitting NURB surface, which I can then, for example, use for reverse engineering inside alias. So you see I turned off the last modifier step because this one creates a very, very dense mesh, and this is already pretty dense, but all I actually want. And this is okay. So with those two modifiers only active, this one is off, I go to File, Export, Wavefront, and for example, say Smooth Fusion, selection only, applied modifier, export. And then, for example, I could go to Fusion. So in Fusion, if you create a new object, you want to make sure that you see this timeline down here. So right mouse button, say capture design history. Currently I'm in, so here I have the reverse, do not, but in case you don't see it, this is where you can turn it on. Then you click on create form. You can go to insert, insert mesh. So we are going to load that polygon model into Fusion, open. I think this one was built in meters. And there's that polygon model. And as you can see, it is actually very close to the Blender model. Fusion has the added advantage that now I can go to modify, convert, and say OK. I have this one, of course, selected. And it creates a T-spline object. Now, the T-spline object is pretty much like the subdivision surface. It takes a really low polygon model and makes it nice and soft. Here, for example, if I go to, if I select the object and hold on 1 second, this is a pretty dense mesh, and then I say right mouse button. Oh wait, might be quicker in the browser now. And display mode, and for example say boxy. There you see, it's again this very boxy design. So it's pretty much the same the way how Blender works. Okay, but T-Spline has the added bonus that the moment I hit finish form, it's converting it actually into NURB surfaces for me. So this is now kind of like what we would like to achieve in Alias. This looks very simple. It's made out of 6 patches, which also means that each NURB surface is insanely dense when it comes to control points. So editing those will be a major pain. So maybe for 3D printing, like a quick concept, that's okay. But if you really want to design and modify this one in Alias, it would be utterly useless. But we can use this one actually as a reference. So with this object, we can go to File, Export, select Step. For example, call it Fusion Step, save, click OK. And then we go back to Alias, go to File, Import, All, go to the desktop. Here's my step file. I'll click Open. Takes a second to load it. And yeah, because I selected meters, of course, that object is way too big. So here's the full model, really too big, so I can scale it. Press Scale, 0.1, Enter. So there, it got smaller already. Actually, maybe 0.01. Yeah, that's the one. So a scale factor of 10 down. And then I can rotate it along the z-axis and try to position it correctly. So we can compare those actually. A little bit more rotation. Okay, let's move this one to there and also turn the shading on. Let's take a look what we have. And you see actually it is a pretty good NURB surface. If we turn on the zebra, you can, for example, see it looks somewhat clean. All these others look kind of crazy. So what was the whole point of why to do this? Actually, this object, for example, right now I'm going to put onto this layer. The rest I turn off. This one, this one, and this one I put onto this layer. And this is a stitched object. So I can go to Surface, Unstitch. There, for example, it shows me now all the control points. So you see how dense, for example, those edges are. So that's really not very good. And there's still, as you can see, some irregularities in it, which is also not really good. But actually, we get an idea of maybe how we could build this object now. So that's what I meant with reverse engineering. I see this, technically speaking, could be possible with side patches and something in the front. So the back cap and the front cap, and 4 patches to the side. And now I have to figure out how to do this. And actually all these spans I'm seeing, I can use as helpers, maybe to get an idea where I have to put cross sections at the side, and for example, how I have to maybe rotate them. And that I'm going to show in the next step.